The first speaker tonight is Sean Golden. I will give him the floor. I'm very curious about his presentation.
Thank you. Do you hear me with this mic? I apologize for having difficulties locating my file. It just started a little bit late. And some of you may have seen part of what I'm going to talk about either in the first week of presentations or if you've been in my classes, but I'm trying to introduce some new material as well. I'll start with the title of the talk, The Crisis of Modernity in China, which implies that China is having difficulties with modernity. But we could also call it China in the crisis of modernity, and see whether the crisis is in modernity itself or whether the crisis is in China. We could also suggest that modernity is the crisis. The first important social scientist who said that was a man named Karl Polanyi, in a book called The Great Transformation, which blamed all of the things that went wrong in the 20th century, up to the time of the Second World War, on modernity itself. So part of what I'm going to talk about is what we understand by modernity. Let's begin with a generic graph. We have a variable, x, and another variable, which is time. This curve can be used to say anything we want about China. If we want to talk about demographic growth, we can use this curve. If we want to talk about economic growth, we can use this curve. If we want to talk about environmental degradation, we can use this curve. If we want to talk about corruption, we can use this curve. Everything that's happening in China is happening on a steadily growing basis. For the last 30 years, the party state in China has managed to maintain sustained economic growth. Whether it can maintain sustainable economic growth is another matter. By contrast, we could have this kind of curve, which would be, for instance, the ex-Soviet Union. Or we might say the economies of the developed countries in the world today, or at least the way the stock market is going, ever since the crisis began with Greece and the euro. So something has been done in China that maintains stability and growth and has lifted 500 million people above the line of poverty. It's defined by the United Nations as living on $1 a day. And China is definitely trying to modernize. Now, whether it has become modern or whether it has entered modernity is part of what this talk will be about. In 1600, Catalan Jesuit Antonio Monserrat died in the court of Akbar, the Muslim emperor of what is now India, the Muslim emperor who had declared religious tolerance and invited thinkers and religious leaders from around the world to come and debate at his court in India. In 1601, the Italian Jesuit Matteo Ricci and the Spanish Jesuit Diego de Pantoja reached Beijing, the capital of the Chinese Empire, where they had been granted permission to preach. In 1600 in London, the East India Company was founded, and given a monopoly on English trade with the East. And in Rome, in 1600, Giordano Bruno was burned. So we could ask ourselves, of these four historical events that took place more or less at the same time, which ones were modern and which ones were backward? And yet, if we think about the way things are today, it would seem that things have been inverted. That tolerance and open societies and liberal democracy, etc., are now found in Rome and in London, if we can say that. And now along Angus Madison, who died recently, but has been quoted by so many of the speakers this semester, we'll look at what the distribution of wealth was in the world from the year 1 to the year 1700. There's no question that China and India were far more wealthy than Western Europe, what would now be North America, or Japan. That the distribution of wealth was clearly in the East. If we begin looking from 1820 and project forward to 2030, we see that China has fallen, India has fallen, and Western Europe, the United States, and Japan have risen. Until the present period, let's say the foundation of the People's Republic of China and the independence of India, when things have begun to turn the other way. So China is rising, India is rising, Western Europe, the United States, Japan are all falling, comparatively speaking. Now, this period corresponds to the high period, Western period. So there was clearly a shift of wealth from one part of the world to the other, and now things may be going back. The question would be, which of these represents the long way, what Fernand Brunel called the long vision of history? Was the Western rise just a parenthesis in what will be seen as a world history dominated by Asia? There is a project being carried out by sociologists around the world to establish world values. They use one scale which is from survival to self-expression, that is, poverty so great that people can only dedicate themselves to having enough to eat or getting by, versus wealth so great that people can dedicate themselves to their own self-expression, and secular rational values versus traditional values, which you might understand as more religious values. What was surprising to the researchers is that when they plotted these values on a map, they formed regions. So we find Protestant Europe very far toward the self-expression and the secular rational values, as we might have expected the Scandinavian countries furthest in that line. English-speaking countries a bit further down, midway between traditional values and secular rational values. Catholic Europe, in the middle, Latin America, closer to survival, traditional values as well. They decided to use red for some reason, to include the ex-communist countries. And we find China very much at the level of secular rational values, and midway between survival and self-expression. Whereas Japan is very clearly high up on the value of secular rational value and also on self-expression. Now, this could be another way of looking at modernity. What makes a country modern here? And I think that there's a bias built into the whole project, which would say that modernity is over here. If you're wealthy and you're secular, you're modern. And if you're poor and religious, you're traditional. But an example of the kinds of studies that are being carried out that I think are useful for talking about the crisis of modernity in China. This is from the end of the 19th century, the high point of European imperialism. It's based on a sketch by Kaiser Wilhelm, and we have the European nations being advised to protect their sacred possessions from what's coming. What's coming is Buddha floating on a cloud, and hordes of yellow armies coming to take away from Europe what Europe has and holds sacred. That indicated how the modern world viewed Asia. The modern world understood as Western Europe.